My name is Joanna. I'm 32 years old. A year ago, I moved back to my family home and now live with my mother, Catherine. The reason I returned home after living on my own was at my mother's request. It was on the day of my grandmother's memorial ceremony when she asked if we could live together again. During the funeral, my mother acted stoically as the representative, but once everything settled down, she probably felt lonely. The way she asked me, she seemed different from the mother I knew. My mother divorced my father when I was in elementary school. She returned to her family home with me and my brother Antonio, and was always cheerful and smiling. Seeing her so vulnerable was a first for me. At that time, I was living independently and working at a design company. Returning home meant leaving a job I loved, so I couldn't respond to my mother's request immediately. It was Dennis, a friend from my college days, who pushed me when I hesitated. "You should be by your mom's side." Thanks to him, I decided to move back. After returning, I switched to a design company closer to home. A year later, my mother had regained her bright smile, and we were having a casual conversation when she said, "Joanna, you must have someone special. You don't need to hide it. I can tell by your expression. I know I worried you, but I'm fine now, so don't hold back. You should get married and not worry about staying here." Her words caught me off guard. "Mom, it's not like that. I enjoy being with you, so don't talk about kicking me out." Her guess wasn't entirely wrong. Unfortunately, the someone special she mentioned was just an unrequited love. I was frustrated I couldn't tell her I was getting married, but I was happy she cared about me. My mother, regaining her work spirit, started going to the job center, and our life, just the two of us, became more joyful. I thought this wasn't so bad. But a week later, everything changed. One day, coming home from work, "Joanna, listen, this Saturday, Antonio is bringing his wife home," my mother said excitedly. Antonio's 26. He left home at 21 to live independently and only returned a few times, my mother told me. The last time Antonio came home was a year ago when our grandmother passed away. After that, he only messaged us about marrying a woman he met at work, and we didn't even know where he lived. Regarding Antonio, my mother said, "He's not a child anymore, so I won't say anything." Though she said that happily, I knew she was worried inside. Contrary to my joyful mother, I had a bad feeling. I just hoped that nothing would happen. On Saturday, when the doorbell rang and we went to the entrance, "What?" "Nice to meet you, I'm Betty," she greeted with a smile. Betty, with exaggerated eyelashes, a belly-showing outfit, a short skirt, and platform sandals that were probably 4 inches high, looked like a teenager. Betty's unexpected appearance left us speechless for a moment. Am I right to be worried? No, I shouldn't judge by appearance. When asked, Betty said she was 21. "Hello there." Betty confidently walked in, and I followed her to the living room. She looked around the room, pointing and taking it all in. "I see. So there are houses like this nowadays?" Well, I guess it's classic. In a way, that's pretty amazing. Betty, who says what she sees, could be described as innocent, I guess. To her and my mother's wry smiles, Betty drops another bombshell. "Antonio's workplace got restructured, so we're gonna live in this old house." What?
"Can't be helped. It's not like I wanted this to happen. Anyway, this house will be mine eventually, so it's our choice when to move in."
"We got kicked out of the company housing and our stuff's arriving tomorrow, so that's the situation, okay?" Huh? Okay. I was anything but calm. But my mother, as expected, started talking calmly. "Restructuring? That must have been tough. By the way, Betty, do your parents know about moving in? We haven't even met them. We should properly visit and greet them." "Oh, it's totally fine. My parents are currently overseas for work." "I see. In that case, we'll have to reschedule for another time." To my surprise, my mother easily accepted the situation. I talked to her in a quiet voice. "Mom, are you okay with this, allowing such unreasonable demands so easily? What can we do? They have nowhere to live. We can't just turn them away now." Leaving his mother alone after his grandparents passed, and then getting married on his own terms, and now moving back home because his workplace got restructured? Unbelievable. The old me wouldn't have let this go with just a complaint or two. But if my mother's okay with it, I guess I have no choice. Reluctantly, I agreed to live together. When discussing room arrangements with Antonio and Betty, they claimed the entire second floor for themselves because they were newlyweds. I was relegated to the first floor, moving into a room that was used as a storage room. Betty seemed eager to cook, saying she'll learn from my mother. I was worried at first, but Betty turned out to be surprisingly obedient. She might speak her mind too bluntly, but it's better than someone who's hard to read. I decided to look at things positively. My mother was happy with the house becoming livelier with more family members. However, she had to put her plan to go back to work again on hold. I thought they were managing well while I was at work during the day. But about 2 weeks after we started living together, I began noticing changes in the house. Antonio and Betty, who used to be up by the time I left for work, started staying in bed. What time do those kids get up in the morning? Oh, it depends. Sensing something was off, I asked my mother for details. I didn't want to worry you, but... With that preface, my mother took me to her room. They have their own schedule and they don't want us to interfere, she was told. What? After a detailed conversation, here's what I found out. They claimed to be the type who skipped breakfast and didn't want to be woken up. They either ordered delivery or ate out for lunch. At night, by the time I got home, Antonio and Betty have already finished dinner. They only eat what they like from my mother's cooking. The enthusiasm Betty showed in learning to cook might have been a lie, possibly to keep my mother, who was planning to work, at home doing housework. Times have changed, and so have the ways young people live, my mother convinced herself. Taking advantage of my mother's silence, Antonio and Betty's behavior escalated. Before long, the kitchen trash was overflowing with snack wrappers and empty plastic bottles. The thing is, Betty has been inviting friends over during the day. And when her friends come over, they wanted my mother to go out, so she would kill time outside. It's hard killing time outside. At this rate, it would be better if I just went back to work, my mother confided in me. Antonio and Betty, who started occupying our family home after Antonio's work was restructured and decided they needed to live together, were under the complete misconception that the house was their own property. This can't go on. Thinking this, I called Antonio to my room while my mother was in the shower. What do you think you're doing? You haven't found work yet. You're not contributing to living expenses and you do whatever you want. And now you want us to leave when your friends come over? Instead of being grateful to Mom, who quietly agreed to let you stay, you're biting the hand that feeds you. Joanna, that's a bit much to say. Betty, who had been listening outside the door, suddenly burst in. I was going to bear a grandchild for Catherine instead of you, Joanna. You can't even get married even though you're 32. You should be thanking me. How dare you? Besides, I get it if Catherine said something, but I don't think we're causing any trouble for you, Joanna. If you don't like us that much, why don't you leave the house?
Betty's right. If you leave, we won't have to see each other anymore. How about that?
Fine, I get it. I'll leave, okay? At that moment, my mother, who was supposed to be in the shower, came in to see what was going on. Catherine, Joanna wants to leave the house. What? Betty spoke before me, leaving me speechless and looking down. I felt her gaze and looked up to meet her smug, serves you right look. This cunning Betty, I now realized, was not to be underestimated. Her expression quickly changed to a smile. Catherine, please ask Joanna for the details, she said and left the room with Antonio. Once I confirmed Antonio and Betty had gone upstairs, I explained everything to my mother. To my surprise, she responded, That might be for the best. Still, I couldn't leave my mother alone in this house. Seeing my concern, she assured me that if things continued this way, she would ask Antonio and Betty to leave. Unable to think of a better solution, I contacted Dennis as usual. I've known Dennis for 14 years since college, and he's 2 years older than me. He's the man I've been secretly in love with. When I hesitantly consulted him about my situation, despite recently updating him about my mother, he said, I see. I was relieved to hear your mom was getting better. Wait, Joanna, I have an idea. I quickly shared Dennis's plan with my mother, who agreed and decided to help us. One Sunday, I told Antonio and Betty to stay home because I had something important to talk about. The doorbell rang while everyone was in the living room. "I have a guest." Antonio and Betty, curious, followed me to the door. "This is Dennis, a friend from college." I introduced him. After introducing my family in the living room, we got to the point. "Antonio, you plan to continue living here, right?"
Yeah, so, and you're leaving, right? 'Cause we have no plans to leave.
"That's fine. I'll be living with Mom in a high-rise apartment." "What? That's not fair." Betty reacted first to my apartment comment. "Not fair? You're staying here and I'm leaving. Where I live is my business, isn't it?" Then Dennis explained further.
"A friend of mine who lives in a high-rise apartment's going overseas for work. He thought it was a waste to leave it empty, so when I heard Joanna was moving out, he offered to sublet it."
"That's right. Thanks to Dennis, I can rent a high-rise at a very affordable rate." "Why does a mere college friend come to our house and explain all this?"
"Well, Joanna's not just a friend, but also a very important person."
"An important person?" Dennis blushed and looked embarrassed at his impromptu ad-lib. He stepped in as a witness for the high-rise apartment story, thinking that Betty and Antonio wouldn't believe it coming just from me. After Dennis left, our house was in an uproar. "Joanna, that's not fair at all. Living in a high-rise apartment was my dream too." Betty seemed more concerned about the high-rise than Dennis's words about me being an important person.
"Weren't you going to stay in this house and bear my mom's grandchild?"
"Well, raising a child costs money, and living in a high-rise is a chance we won't get once we have kids. Please, let us have the apartment," Betty pleaded desperately. Though I was not inclined to listen, she even begged just to see the place. Dennis said we couldn't see the inside yet, but I reluctantly took Betty so she could see the outside. "Whoa, amazing. You're gonna live here, Joanna? I'm so jealous." Looking up at the 30-story tower, Betty kept repeating how envious she was.
"You like the high-rise that much? What if you and your husband lived there instead?"
"What? Really?" Betty jumped for joy like a child. "Dennis, that's going too far," I said, puzzled by his intention to give them the apartment. Meanwhile, Betty was already on the phone with Antonio, completely oblivious to my feelings. The move-in date was set for a month later, and Dennis had 2 conditions for renting the apartment. First, find re-employment by the move-in date, and second, pay the rent by the end of each month. "Antonio, I'll pay half the rent for you. In exchange, I need collateral. Transfer your car's title to my name. I'll manage it."
"Come on, Joanna, not the car. Do you know how much it cost me?"
"You don't have any credit, so it can't be helped. I need collateral in case something happens, or I'll be the only one at a loss. If you don't like it, forget the high-rise." Antonio fell silent, and Betty chimed in. "Hey, Antonio, we can always buy another car if you work. I want to live in the high-rise. I absolutely hate the idea of staying in this old house forever."
All right, I'll do what you say, Joanna."
Antonio agreed too easily, looking pitiful. The part about me paying half the rent was, of course, a lie. In reality, as long as Antonio didn't default, my actual cost was $0, thanks to the cheap rent. Betty, already dreaming of high-rise living, immediately sent Antonio to the job center. He found a job within 2 weeks. But the commute from the new apartment would be nearly 2 hours each way. Betty had rushed him to settle on any job without considering the commute or salary. Antonio complained, but it was his decision. The owner left some furniture like tables and chairs in the apartment. If you don't want them, they said they'd move them elsewhere. What do you think? Of course, we'd be happy to use them. Joanna, thank you for all your help. I arranged the move, and Dennis would handle the delivery on the move-in day. Betty thanked me with a broad smile. On the day they moved out, my mother and I saw off Antonio and Betty at the front door.
"Betty, I've been meaning to say this. Can't you do something about those sandals? It would be terrible if you fell."
I had thought the same as my mother. "I'm fine. I don't fall. Well, it was short, but thank you for everything."
"See ya."
Antonio and Betty left our family home with beaming smiles, clearly thrilled. Well, let's see how long that smile lasts. They were supposed to meet Dennis at the entrance of the high-rise and get the keys. My phone should be ringing any minute now. As my mother and I talked, my phone rang. "Joanna, what the heck?" Betty shouted over the phone. Her voice was so high-pitched, it seemed she might burst out of the phone.
What? Why are you yelling? What do you mean?
Don't act dumb. You didn't tell us it was a room on the first floor. We can't even see the night view. This is no different from a normal apartment. And what are these tables and chairs? They're plain office desks and chairs.
Well, I never lied. It's your fault for not checking properly. If you have complaints, why don't you just not live there?
That's impossible. I've already told my friends I'm living in a high-rise. I can't back out now.
Betty's earlier bravado was gone, replaced with disappointment, and she hung up abruptly. Antonio and Betty were living in a room that the owner originally used as an office. Since Dennis had also considered using it as an office, he had left the office desks and such as they were. Of course, they had already agreed to rent it as a residence. After that, Antonio and Betty stopped contacting me. They paid the first month's rent as promised, but stopped paying from the second month on. Though the agreement was to move out if they didn't pay, I deliberately didn't contact them. About 6 months into the non-payment, Antonio suddenly called me.
Joanna.
Is this a call to apologize for not paying rent?
No, it's not that. I need to borrow some money.
That's not possible. Can you return my car? You're asking for money now? As for the car, I can't return it. I've sold it.
What? Why did you sell it without even consulting me?
You didn't pay the rent. It's your fault. You knew that was the deal when you took the apartment.
Okay.
Disappointed and shocked that his car had been sold, Antonio replied disheartenedly. He probably never thought his sister would actually sell his car. I wouldn't want people to take me lightly just because we're siblings. I had anticipated from the beginning that Antonio wouldn't be able to pay the rent consistently. Insisting on transferring the car's title was the right move. Then I called my mother right away. For the weekend, under the pretext of treating Antonio and Betty, my mother made dinner reservations at a high-end restaurant and invited them. We arranged to meet at the restaurant's entrance. Anticipating Antonio and Betty would be late, we told them an earlier meeting time and headed there. Arriving a bit late to the restaurant, I deliberately parked the car at the front entrance to let my mother out, and then went to park.
Joanna, that's harsh. You didn't sell my car after all?
I had driven the car I got from Antonio. Where's Betty? What happened to her?
She's inside, sitting and waiting.
Betty, as usual, couldn't wait and sat alone inside. Entering the private room. What? There was Betty, looking like a completely different person, dressed in an elegant white dress and with subdued makeup. Huh? Betty, what happened? Your leg.
I sprained my ankle when I fell.
Betty's right foot was in a cast, a sullen look on her face. Did she really fall? That was unexpected. My mother and I exchanged glances, and couldn't help but laugh.
It's not funny!
Well, I did warn you about the danger of those platform sandals.
They weren't sandals, I was wearing high heels.
Whether it was sandals or high heels didn't matter, I retorted to Betty, who was getting worked up. That's what happens when you pretend to be something you're not. It's your own fault. Stung by my words, or perhaps not understanding, Betty didn't have a comeback. Betty's mood, dampened by my harsh words, improved while eating the sumptuous full-course meal. After settling the bill and leaving the restaurant,
"Thanks for inviting us, Mom and Joanna. We could never afford such a luxurious meal."
It's fine. I never had the chance to eat like this before either.
By the way, Joanna, when are you going to return my car?
The car? I can't return it. It's scheduled to be handed over tomorrow. I've already done the appraisal.
What?
Don't be so surprised. I'll return the money from the car sale, but I'll deduct various expenses, unpaid rent, living expenses from when you were at home, and today's $1,000 restaurant bill.
What?
Let's part ways here, since you guys need to go home in the other direction, I said, leaving Antonio and Betty behind as I got into the car to leave the parking lot.
Hey, Joanna, look at that.
What? My mother pointed and I saw Antonio and Betty arguing in front of the restaurant. What are they doing? Driving up to Antonio and Betty, my mother rolled down the passenger window and scolded them.
What are you two doing? Don't cause a scene here.
Surprised by our arrival, Antonio and Betty looked up.
Mom, you came at the right time. I'm saying we should go back home, but Betty's refusing.
What are you talking about? It's too late for that. The house has been demolished.
What?
We decided to rebuild it. Joanna and I will live there. Betty was speechless and slumped to the ground.
"Well, you two better get going before it gets late,"
we said, leaving Antonio and Betty behind. As for what happened to Antonio and Betty, who had no car and couldn't return home, the story continues. Betty's parents, supposedly abroad, were actually in the country. I recalled Betty's reluctance to talk about her parents during her first visit. I visited her family home with my mother. Sure enough, her parents were there. Betty had lied about them being abroad, fearing they would take her back home if they knew Antonio's work was restructured. After discussing how to deal with Antonio and Betty's selfish behavior, both families agreed that if they ended up in a tight spot again, Betty's father would take responsibility and bring them back home. Right after parting ways with Antonio and Betty at the restaurant, I contacted Betty's father, who likely went to the apartment the next day. He called to say he had decided to take Antonio and Betty home, and under the condition of them living together, he agreed to cover the expenses Betty incurred using Antonio's card and the apartment's restoration costs. I deducted various expenses I had paid in advance from the car's sale proceeds and handed over the remaining money to Betty's father. At my mother's strong request, Antonio started working at a company owned by a friend of Betty's father to rebuild his character. Returning to the day we went to the restaurant. After parting ways with Antonio and Betty, my mother, in the passenger seat, said, "I'm hungry again." "Oh, Mom. I am too, actually." We hadn't felt satisfied with the fancy restaurant's course meal. We decided to have dinner again, this time inviting Dennis. Dennis lived near our old house that got demolished.
"Dennis, I finally got a break today. It's all thanks to you. How can I thank you for preparing an apartment for me?"
"Miss Catherine, that's an exaggeration. I'm the one who's honored to be entrusted with rebuilding your family home." When Dennis visited our old home to discuss the high-rise apartment, he suggested rebuilding our old wooden and significantly weathered house. I had been concerned about our aging family home, but decided to wait until my mother settled down. Having watched my mother struggle to raise 2 children after her divorce, I had managed to save up a substantial amount of money. With the savings and the money left by my grandparents, I decided to go ahead with the rebuild. Dennis was an architect. After graduating from college, he gained experience and built a reputation in a design office. And at 30, he started his own firm. As an interior designer, it was my dream to work alongside him. I left the architectural design to him and took charge of the interior design. Actually, the transfer of the high-rise apartment to Antonio and Betty was also a thoughtful gesture from him, considering my mother. "Miss Catherine, I want to marry Joanna."
"What? What are you saying all of a sudden, Dennis?"
"I come from a child welfare facility, and though my mother's alive, she has her own family."
"Dennis, don't worry about that. Look, we're a single-parent family, too."
Overwhelmed by his sudden confession, I couldn't find the words to speak.
Seeing their interaction, I couldn't help but tear up. "Joanna, why are you crying?" "Well, I'm so glad to hear that, Dennis. Congratulations to both of you."
While saying this, my mother also started to cry, moved by my reaction. I never expected such a surprising turn of events. The next morning, I woke up wondering if it had all been a dream. A few months later, our rebuilt family home was completed. And that's when Dennis and I got married. "Dennis, consider my mom and I your family," I said to my husband. He scratched his head, blushing and smiling shyly. In this newly reborn house, our family started a new chapter. And then, 5 years later, we now have a 3-year-old daughter and a 1-year-old son. My husband, having moved his office near our home at the time of our marriage, was now even more motivated in his work for the children. After giving birth to our first daughter, I left the design company I worked for and helped out in my husband's office, with my mother helping me raise the children. It seems my mother is also wanting to go back to work again. We're thinking of putting our kids in daycare. Antonio and Betty now have 2 children too. The family comes to our house on the weekends. Betty has changed a lot since being brought back to their family home, and now wears natural makeup and long skirts. Having had a child, she now wears sneakers as a staple, perhaps thinking it's not wise to carry a child and risk falling. This weekend, Antonio and his family visited again, and their 4-year-old son whispered to me,
"This is actually Daddy's house, you know."